Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. Well, we're finally here. The granddaddy of all Good Lawyers Gone Bad stories, the story of Watergate. If you didn't listen to the last two installments of the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast, you probably don't need to. You'll understand the story of Watergate if you just listen to this. But I think going back and listening to it will probably be nice because I give you the backdrop to what led up to this crazy story. I hope if you enjoy the program that you will go on your podcasting platform of choice and rate us and leave us a comment, that sort of thing. Give us 5 stars if you don't mind. It really helps us. I appreciate it. If you've got any questions or comments, go to goodlawyersgonebad.com. Go to the Contact Us section and send me a message. It comes right to my email. Enjoy this program about Watergate. My father says things that drive me crazy. And he's so stubborn sometimes that it's just incredible. I'll give you a perfect example. One time I asked him, "Hey, Dad, did you go to that meeting last night? How many people were there?" You know what his response was? He said, "I don't know, something like 10 or 20 some odd people." Ard. Ard. A-R-D. 10 or 20 some odd people. I said, "Dad, the expression is odd. 10 or 20 some odd people." He said, "Odd? That sounds ridiculous." Really? Odd sounds ridiculous, but ard sounds okay to you? What exactly is an ard, Dad? He drives me nuts. The other thing he said all the time when I was a kid, he would say, "You know how much that's going to cost? What do you think, I'm made out of money? You think it grows on trees?" Well, Dad, the answer I have today is yes. Money does grow on trees. And actually, when money starts out, it sort of looks like it just came off the tree. American money, cash, it's printed on paper that's made up of high-quality cotton and linen. At the beginning of the process, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C. actually rolls in pallets of the material, and the cotton is all messy and poofy, and it literally looks at that point in the process like it was just taken off the tree. That concoction of materials is purified in large boilers where the temperature reaches as high as 280 degrees Fahrenheit. What comes out is a clean blend of fibers that are transformed into a pulp. It's then pressed and rolled into paper strips. That paper is then embedded with tiny security threads that glow under ultraviolet light, along with other security measures, and then a chemical coating is applied to the paper. The paper then goes through 2 printing stages. One is an offset printing stage. During that part of the printing, every $100 bill is assigned a unique serial number that allows it to be traced and also further enhances security. In the final part of the printing, ink is run over engraved metal plates and the paper is pressed into those plates under extreme pressure so the paper absorbs the ink. What you then have is a finished product bearing that famous portrait of Benjamin Franklin. Trained inspectors then verify the quality of the product by literally standing over sheets of uncut $100 bills with a magnifying glass. After inspections, those sheets are sent to cutting stations where they're cut into individual bills. Those bills are separated into bundles. Each bundle is strapped with a paper band. Those bundles are put into larger stacks. That entire package is shrink-wrapped and a barcode is affixed to the outside of the package. That barcode tells the Bureau of Engraving and Printing where to deliver the money. And the serial number on the money also matches the place it's being delivered to. The money is then loaded into armored currency transport trucks and delivered to one of the Federal Reserve Bank cash offices throughout the country. The Federal Reserve Bank cash office then distributes the banknotes to commercial banks where they are put into circulation. Money is an important part of a presidential campaign. You need money to do everything. It costs money to hold events. It costs money to travel to those events. It costs money to buy ads, everything. It's really expensive. And that is why Richard Nixon needed money during his presidential reelection campaign in 1972. Yeah, he needed it for all of the usual campaign stuff, but he also needed it for the other stuff his people were doing that he didn't tell anybody about. The things his campaign were doing below the radar. The things that were being done by a man named Howard Hunt. Most CIA agents don't have the chiseled muscular features of The Rock. In real life, agents don't have the steely blue eyes of Daniel Craig. No, real-life CIA agents look a lot less like a Jason Bourne and a lot more like an average Joe. And that was just fine for Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt was the kind of guy that you wouldn't notice on the street. He was average height, average build, and balding. He looked like every other person walking down the sidewalk. Aside from the fact that he smoked a pipe, there wasn't anything that stood out about the man. And the truth is, if you would have seen him smoking that pipe while walking down the street in Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s, you wouldn't find it so out of the ordinary. Pipes were far more of a thing in the 70s than they are today. Now, if you walked by Howard Hunt, you wouldn't know that he was one of the most accomplished covert operatives in the history of the United States. You wouldn't know that the man walking alongside of you on that fall day in 1971 had successfully orchestrated a coup of the president of Guatemala a few years earlier. You wouldn't suspect that he was the mind behind the attempted ouster of Fidel Castro in Cuba during the operation known as the Bay of Pigs. And you wouldn't think anything of the fact that he was about to walk into the old executive office building, the place where the Vice President of the United States had his office. Howard Hunt wasn't going in to see the vice president. No, Howard went downstairs to the basement. Howard Hunt went into a nondescript room known only as Room 16. It was the secret office of a secret group who was charged with doing secret things. Hunt was part of an unofficial group called the Plumbers. The job of this unauthorized assembly of covert operations was to plug leaks that were coming out of the White House. Richard Nixon was finishing up his first term as president, and he wanted to ensure that he had a landslide in his upcoming re-election. The Plumbers' job was to ensure that that happened by any means necessary. And they had actually just completed their inaugural operation. The group broke into the office of a psychiatrist that was treating a man named Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg leaked a top-secret government report about the Vietnam War to the New York Times. When the Times printed the report they called the Pentagon Papers, the White House decided that something needed to be done. The Plumbers were given the job of dealing with it. The way they decided to deal with it was to try to discredit Ellsberg by stealing his medical files and leaking them to the press. But they botched the job. They broke into the doctor's office, they didn't find the files they were looking for, and they left empty-handed. But when Howard Hunt got to Room 16 and debriefed with his people, he didn't see the job as a failure at all. Quite the contrary, he saw it as a success. Sure, they didn't get the files, but they also didn't get caught. And what they did get was confidence. They got into the doctor's office, they got out of the doctor's office, and nothing they did was tied back to the White House. That was a win. Sure, there were lessons to be learned about how to improve the next time, but Howard Hunt was emboldened by the operation. There would be a next time, and Howard Hunt would be ready. The other person who was likewise encouraged was one of Hunt's fellow plumbers, a man named G. Gordon Liddy. Gordon Liddy was a strange bird. The man seemed like he was always looking for trouble. If you believe press reports, as a young boy, Liddy was upset when World War II ended because he was too young to fight. If only it would have gone on for a few more years, he thought, I could have aged into the war. Yeah, he was upset that he didn't get to go to war. Eventually, he got his wish, sort of. Liddy served with the army, but it was during peacetime, which was probably a bummer for Gordon. Liddy eventually went to college and got a law degree from Fordham University in New York City. After a stint in the FBI, Liddy became a district attorney and eventually entered the world of politics. He lost a primary race for a congressional seat, but he stayed in the game when he agreed to run one of the regional campaign offices for Richard Nixon's successful bid for the White House in 1968. After Nixon's election, Liddy got a job working in the Department of Treasury. That's where he met a guy who brought him into the plumbers. And that was when Liddy's thirst for action would finally be quenched. G. Gordon Liddy was one of the plumbers who broke into the psychiatrist's office. Howard Hunt might have been emboldened by the break-in, but Gordon Liddy was energized by it. He was eager to keep it going, and he was about to get his wish. The plumbers were disbanded shortly after the psychiatrist's office break-in, but the break-in was a technicality. The men who made up the group were simply transferred. They moved from working in a clandestine group in the White House to working in a clandestine group in Nixon's presidential re-election campaign. They became members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, known by its acronym, CREEP. The goal of CREEP was pretty much the same as that of the plumbers, to make sure that Richard Nixon's re-election happened easily. To do that, CREEP took the lessons they learned during the psychiatrist office break-in and got to work planning their next act. The person who would mastermind the next steps would be the mentally delicate G. Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon Liddy was itching for action. But it was the type of action that Liddy was attracted to that made things weird. Liddy had a strange passion for dirty, clandestine operations. And the specific ideas he floated as CREEP's potential next moves prove why I said he was a strange bird. A strange, dangerous bird. Liddy was about to present those ideas at a very important meeting. A meeting that would be attended by, of course, Howard Hunt, but also his other fellow operatives at CREEP, as well as their newly minted leader. It was spring of 1972. The presidential election was only 8 months away. That made Richard Nixon anxious. He simply had to win a second term. He had to win for his ego's sake and the way he saw it, for the sake of the country. The United States needed Richard Nixon to run the country. How could they not? Think of what was going on. China was becoming a world power. The Vietnam War was raging, and we were also in the process of winding it down. Plus, someone had to ease the tensions of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon believed that he was presiding over the country at one of the most critical times in history, and his people needed him. He believed that they specifically needed Richard Nixon at the helm. And if anyone other than him won the presidency, he believed it would be disastrous for the country. A loss would also be a disaster for him personally. When your entire life is geared towards being president, your re-election becomes of paramount importance. It had to be a sure thing. And when you also happen to be a paranoid, power-hungry politician with a God complex, you find it very easy to make the ends justify the means. That's why he was happy with going after Daniel Ellsberg over the Pentagon Papers. The leaker was facing criminal charges, and that probably made Richard Nixon very happy. An enemy of his campaign was facing time behind bars, and any like-minded vigilantes were sure to be dissuaded from doing anything similar. They were all on notice. You don't screw with Richard Nixon. In addition to being encouraged by events occurring around him, Nixon was also enabled by the people he selected to be around him. People like John Mitchell. John Mitchell was tailor-made for Richard Nixon. That's because Richard Nixon liked fighters, and John Mitchell was a fighter. Sort of literally. John Mitchell was a well-respected New York lawyer who put himself through college by playing semi-professional hockey. So yeah, fighting was in his blood. The president met Mitchell during the brief time that Nixon went back into private practice. Nixon was humiliated by John F. Kennedy when he lost the race for the White House in 1960, and he suffered another humiliation when he unsuccessfully ran for governor of California in 1962. That's when Richard Nixon decided to dip his toe back in the water of private legal practice, but only for a short time. That's also where he met fellow lawyer John Mitchell. In John Mitchell, Nixon saw a man who knew how to fight and who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The timing of their meeting could not have been better. Richard Nixon was feeling low, and his new confidant would help pick him up and put the pieces of his political life back together. John Mitchell convinced Nixon to run for the White House in 1968. And when Nixon decided to run, he made the scrappy lawyer his campaign manager. Many people believe that it was Mitchell's brilliance and tenacity that got Nixon elected altogether. After Richard Nixon was inaugurated, he brought along his new right-hand man, and John Mitchell was made Attorney General of the United States. Nixon wanted a fighter to be the country's top lawyer, and John Mitchell knew that you had to fight for what you believed in. He also seems to have shared a particular critical philosophy with Richard Nixon. Mitchell seems to have believed that, for the good of the country, the ends often justified the means. During his tenure as Attorney General, Mitchell was known for taking tough, principled stances on issues that he believed were for the good of the country. His tough-as-nails approach was exactly what Richard Nixon valued. And that's why, after Mitchell faithfully executed the duties of the Attorney General for several years, Richard Nixon asked John Mitchell to change jobs. In the spring of 1972, the most important thing to Richard Nixon was getting reelected. So he put his best people on that project. And that's why John Mitchell went from being the top lawyer in the administration to becoming the top person on the campaign. Mitchell resigned his position as Attorney General and became the head of the re-election campaign. That meant that Howard Hunt, Gordon Liddy, and the rest of the creep group were part of John Mitchell's world. So it came to pass that when Gordon Liddy presented his ideas for the next steps that creep would take in their covert political influence campaign, former Attorney General John Mitchell was in attendance at that meeting. To Liddy, breaking into a psychiatrist's office was child's play. And that operation didn't really provide the benefit they were really looking for anyway. If they needed to ensure that Richard Nixon was reelected, they needed to go big. And they needed to go after some big players. So Liddy proposed an operation he called Gemstone. Gemstone wasn't so much a coherent operation as it was a bunch of strange ideas, each of which was a little more nutty than the other. When you hear Liddy's ideas, you realize that he seemed fixated on the upcoming convention of the Democratic Party, where they would be nominating their candidate for president that would oppose Nixon. If they could disrupt that meeting, it would help Nixon's candidacy. So, toward that end, one idea Liddy had was to make the upcoming meeting of the Democratic National Convention miserable. He recommended that they sabotage the air conditioning system in the main hall of the convention so that the party's nominee would be forced to address the packed delegates in 100-degree Miami summer heat. That idea made the former Attorney General smirk, but it didn't seem like a winner. Not to worry, Liddy had other ideas. Liddy's other idea involved prostitutes. Oh yeah, Liddy recommended that the group pay prostitutes to seduce power brokers from the Democrat Party who were attending the convention. The prostitutes would then lure the men to a houseboat that was being operated by Creep. That houseboat would have spy equipment on board where they'd record the men having sex with the prostitutes and then, presumably, use those recordings to blackmail the influential Democrats into silence during the campaign. Oh, but there was more. Liddy didn't just want to disrupt the Democrats' convention. He wanted to make sure that the Republicans' convention ran smoothly. To ensure that, he recommended that they silence anti-war protesters who were sure to gather outside the convention arena. Liddy proposed that they kidnap the leaders of the anti-war movement, drug them, and transport them to Mexico, where they would be held by creep until the convention was over. And if that's not enough, he had one more idea. Liddy proposed that the group assassinate a newspaper columnist who was reporting about the Nixon campaign in a negative way. Tell me something. What would your response have been to those ideas? What would you have said to someone who recommended that the campaign arm of the sitting president of the United States of America engage in blackmail, kidnapping, and murder? The leader of the group, the former Attorney General of the United States, he had only one response. He said, somewhat amusingly, "Gordon, go back and find something realistic." The realistic idea that Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt came up with was less audacious than the massive law-breaking suggested by Liddy at that meeting, but it was still a crime. The men recommended that they break into the offices of the Democratic National Committee headquarters and install surveillance equipment so they could spy on their activities. John Mitchell liked that idea. It made sense. If you can hear all the phone calls and listen to all the conversations that the Democrat operatives were having, it would be like having their playbook. You could counter every one of their moves on the campaign battlefield with ease. This idea, Mitchell believed, was a keeper. John Mitchell approved the operation. This is what happens when people in power have carte blanche to do whatever they want, as long as the ends justify the means. This is what happens when you're given the authority to overthrow governments in Central America, when you are told that breaking into a psychiatrist's office is necessary to help your country win a war against communists. All of that creates a belief that anything you choose to do, as long as it's for the good of the country, is justified. And when your boss, the President of the United States, is letting all of that happen, it creates a little group of clandestine monsters. Well, the deal was done. The break-in to the office of the Democrat National Headquarters was a go. But there was a logistical hurdle. It was going to cost money. Luckily, the group Creep had a money spigot they could turn on. After all, it was campaign donation season. It's not cheap to engage in clandestine operations. Equipment has to be purchased, salaries of the operatives need to be paid, bribes may need to be made. It can be an expensive affair. The members of Creep intended to finance their operations with campaign donations. The problem was you can't just take a check from a donor, cash it, and go spend it on something like surveillance equipment for an illegal break-in. That leaves a trace. So the members of the Nixon campaign had to get inventive. They had to launder the money. Laundering money is the process criminals employ to allow them to use their ill-gotten gains without tipping off the authorities that it's money they shouldn't have. You never really make dirty money clean. You just try to make it tough for anyone to figure out where the funds actually came from. They try to basically erase the source of the money. That's what the Nixon campaign had to do. They couldn't make it known that they were using campaign donations for criminal efforts. So they tried to hide the source. Take one donation as an example. The campaign approached the CEO of a major American corporation and asked him to donate $20,000. The man wrote a personal check which he gave to a campaign representative. The campaign representative then gave that check to the treasurer of the re-election campaign. But instead of depositing that check into the account for the re-election campaign, the treasurer gave the check to Gordon Liddy. Liddy gave that check to a man named Bernard Barker. Barker had a company called Barker and Associates. Barker deposited that check into his business account located in the Republic Bank of Miami. So now it just seemed like a personal check that one businessman wrote to another. In a short while, Bernard Barker would then withdraw the money from his bank in Miami as cash and give that cash back to Gordon Liddy. Liddy would then use that cash to finance the creep operations. If you can't follow the money and you don't know where the cash came from, well, then that money's been laundered. In addition to the money deposited into Bernard Barker's Miami bank account, the campaign raised another $1.7 million, and this is 1970 dollars. Some of that was deposited into banks across the United States and Mexico, but a cool $1 million in cash was hidden in safes and safe deposit boxes, including $350,000 in cash that was placed into the White House safe controlled by President Nixon's chief of staff. By the way, all of the middlemen in that operation, who I didn't name for purposes of not confusing you with a whole bunch of names, all the people who helped get that money into the hands of people like Bernard Barker of Miami, they were all lawyers. The next time you're in Washington, D.C., take the metro to the Foggy Bottom station. When you get off the train, take the escalator back up to street level, and when you emerge from the station, make a right. Walk down to the first street corner and make another right. If you walk straight on that road, in a few blocks you'll find yourself at a traffic circle. If you look across the street on the other side of that traffic circle, you'll see one of the most famous buildings in United States history. Actually, it's a series of buildings. Right there on the banks of the Potomac River is the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex. The Watergate Hotel is an attractive property. I stayed there a few years ago when I was in town giving a CLE speech at an event not too far away. The owners renovated the hotel not too long ago, and they did a great job. It's got well-appointed rooms with beautiful views of the Potomac River. But most people don't think of the accommodations when they hear the word Watergate. They don't think about the fact that it's called Watergate because it's a gate onto the Potomac. They don't think about the residences that are located in other buildings in that same complex. And they don't think about the retail stores located on the first level facing the beautiful courtyard. No, when people think about Watergate, they think of the office buildings, and one in particular. Around the corner from the hotel, on a small stretch of road, are buildings that contain several of the offices in the Watergate complex. And in 1972, on the 6th floor of one of those buildings was an office of the headquarters of the Democrat National Committee. That office was the target of the creep break-in. In early May 1972, the operatives from Creep got ready for their operation. They studied the layout of that office building, and they took account of the building's security protocols. The team gathered specialized equipment including lockpicks, door jimmies, wiretapping devices, 35mm cameras for photographing documents, and pen-sized tear gas guns that they could use for self-defense. Howard Hunt probably got some of those items from his buddies at the CIA. And the purchase of all those items was apparently financed by the cash Gordon Liddy stashed throughout Washington, D.C. Part of their surveillance efforts was to identify the entry and exit points. The group figured out exactly which doors they'd need to use to get in and out of the DNC offices undetected. They then went to the facility and put tape over the closing mechanisms in those doors to ensure that they wouldn't lock when they were shut. Then, one of the members of Creep rented a hotel room at the Howard Johnson's motel across the street from Watergate, room 419. That hotel room would serve as a surveillance post where Creep members would monitor the operation and communicate with the burglary team through walkie-talkies. They were now ready for the break-in. On May 28th, with part of the team monitoring the events from that Howard Johnson hotel room, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy broke into the DNC offices in the Watergate complex. While they were there, they photographed some documents and they planted listening devices on the phones. The operation went off without a hitch. The plumbers, now officially members of Creep, had struck again. This time they didn't just not get caught, they actually achieved their objective. They placed listening devices in the phones at the headquarters of the Democrat National Committee, and it was, by all accounts, a successful operation. If only the equipment they installed could have been as reliable as the operatives who installed it. A few days later, after inserting those listening devices, some of them broke. This was a big problem. Without those devices, there was no way for Creep to gather the intelligence they needed to ensure a Nixon win. So the men decided to go back in and replace the faulty bugs. Howard Hunt, he didn't want to do it. They'd gone back and re-inspect the premises quietly, and they noticed that some of the tape on the key entry doors had been removed. But Gordon Liddy wasn't having any of it. He believed that they had enough access to the building to get the job done. He was gung-ho about getting that job done. So Howard Hunt was overruled, and the second break-in was a go. On the night of June 17, 1972, the team from Creep went into action. They started by establishing another lookout at the Howard Johnson's motel. This time, it was room 723. After confirming that their lookout was in place, the operatives approached the Watergate building. One of the men picked the lock at the door leading to the parking garage. They then went through a door they'd taped open that led from the garage into a stairwell. They then took those stairs up 6 floors to the office of the Democrat National Committee headquarters. Once in the DNC offices, they got to the plan, fixing the listening devices and taking photographs of documents. Around the times that the burglars entered the DNC offices, a night security guard had just come on duty. While doing his rounds for what was probably the first time that night, he noticed something strange. There was tape on one of the doors in the building leading to the stairwell. The tape was holding in the mechanism that was controlled by the door handle. The security guard didn't think much of it. He figured that it was probably left by the maintenance or custodial crew, and he removed it. He then shut all the lights in the hall and continued with his rounds. Meanwhile, the operatives were taking a little bit longer than they expected. Replacing the bugs was apparently a little bit more time-consuming than they'd thought. While part of the team was doing that work, one of the team members left the offices to do a little recon. It seems that he wanted to make sure that there was nobody watching them and that their exit strategy was still intact. When he went out to check everything, he noticed that someone had removed the tape from one of the doors they needed to access. So he replaced it. A short while later, the night guard noticed that some of the doors connecting the underground parking garage to the office levels had paper jammed into them. It looked like it was done purposefully to keep the doors from shutting. The guard decided to circle back to those first doors where he removed the tape earlier. When he got there, he noticed that those door latches had been retaped. That's when he knew that something was wrong. The guard hustled back to the Watergate security office and called the cops. He reported that there was a possible burglary in process. He informed the dispatcher about the tape door and requested immediate assistance. There were no marked cars available at the time, so the D.C. Metro Police dispatched an unmarked car with 3 plainclothes officers. The cops kept their lights off and approached the Watergate complex quietly so as not to alert any bad guys who might be doing bad things. They went to the security office, they showed their badges to the security guard, and the guard then showed the cops the door that was taped shut. Yeah, they looked at it and thought, this is a problem. The officers then began to search the building. The lookout stationed across the street at the Howard Johnsons should have seen the cops pull up. He should have noticed the unmarked police vehicle pull up to the building, even if it didn't have any lights on. He was positioned right across the street. If you ever go to the area, you would see that you can't miss a car pulling up, even if it was dark. but the lookout was preoccupied. He was watching a television show called Attack of the Puppet People. He was so engrossed in the show that his eyes were glued to the TV set when the cops pulled up. He never saw the car arrive. Meanwhile, inside Watergate, the plainclothes officers started their search by taking the elevator to the 8th floor and then working their way down, checking each floor for signs of intrusion. When they got to the 6th floor, they found the doors with tape on them. The cops' adrenaline started pumping. They noticed that the door of the DNC offices were slightly ajar. The men drew their weapons and kicked the door in movie style. But when they got in there and looked around the room, they saw that it was in disarray, but there was no one in the area. The cops then walked down the hallways of the DNC offices with their guns drawn. They turned on every light to every office that they passed just to make sure that there was no one in there hiding from them. And then, as they walked by one of the offices, an elbow banged onto a glass partition, startling one of the officers. The cops then burst into that office and shouted, "Police! Hands in the air!" And 10 hands immediately shot up. The lookout in the Howard Johnsons was still watching his TV show intently when out of the corner of his eye, he saw the lights go on in the DNC office across the street. Through the window, he could see what was happening. That's when he picked up the phone, called the Creep Home office, and let whomever answered the phone know, "We have a problem." At first, the D.C. Metro Police considered the incident to be nothing more than a run-of-the-mill burglary. Sure, it was a little weird. These burglars were dressed in suits and ties. But they didn't think it was that strange. It got a little bit more strange when the men in suits refused to give them their names. It got even more strange when the cops found the briefcases the men had brought with them, which contained things like lockpicks and door jimmies, a shortwave receiver that could pick up police phone calls, rolls and rolls of unexposed film, cameras, and pen-sized tear gas guns. It actually wasn't too tough for the cops to figure out who at least some of the burglars were. That's because 2 of the men brought their address books with them. When the cops looked into that evidence, they realized that one of the men was a guy named John McCord. They recognized that name because John McCord was the head of security for the Nixon presidential campaign. As for the other man, they knew his name, but they didn't yet know why it was important. They did notice, however, that he had with him $2,300 in sequentially marked $100 bills that were still wrapped in the binding that was affixed by the Bureau of Printing and Engraving in Washington, D.C. Sequential bills whose serial numbers would reveal that after they were printed, cut, and bundled in Washington, D.C., they were then transported to the Federal Reserve Bank cash office in Atlanta, Georgia. From there, those very bundles of money were shipped to the Republic Bank in Miami, Florida, and they were withdrawn from that bank when a man named Bernard Barker of Barker and Associates withdrew that money from his account. Bernard Barker, the man who had deposited that campaign check given to him by Gordon Liddy. Bernard Barker, a businessman from Miami? Perhaps. But he was also Bernard Barker, Cuban-American. Bernard Barker, Cuban-American, former CIA officer who was, years ago, a member of the invasion force during the Bay of Pigs operation. Bernard Barker, a man who was at that very moment being arrested by plainclothes police officers at the Watergate office complex. The D.C. police realized that this was no ordinary burglary. It was time to call in the FBI. The morning after the break-in, the director of the FBI was notified that one of the burglars arrested was James McCord, chief of security for the Nixon re-election campaign. That fact made the investigation incredibly delicate, so it called for a qualified, seasoned agent to handle the matter. The director assigned his second-in-command to the case, Assistant Director Mark Felt. Mark Felt was probably eager to take on the case. Not only would it be interesting to look into whether the Nixon campaign had something to do with the break-in, but it might be gratifying for Mr. Felt as well. Mark Felt, it seems, had a bit of a beef with Richard Nixon. When J. Edgar Hoover retired as the head of the FBI, Mark Felt wanted the job leading the organization. But Nixon passed over him. Felt, it seems, was sore about it. So the agent might be able to get, maybe a double whammy in this case. He could do his duty on behalf of the FBI and also make the administration's life a little bit miserable. The newsroom in the Washington Post must have been a hectic place. The D.C. bureau of that paper at the time was staffed with the best of the best, whether they be old veteran reporters or newbies who were just starting out. One of those newbies was a young reporter named Bob Woodward. You can imagine his excitement when his editor screamed across the noisy newsroom about his next assignment. He said, "Head over to the courthouse. There was a burglary at the Watergate complex last night, and the suspects are being arraigned. Look at this one carefully. One of the burglars is Nixon's chief of security." That surely made Woodward's ears perk up. And as he headed out to the courthouse, one of his colleagues, another young guy named Carl Bernstein, he offered to help out. He said, "I'll make some phone calls and see what we can figure out." And just like that, the most famous journalistic duo in United States history was formed. Woodward and Bernstein were on the case. When the burglars were caught, the Nixon administration started to panic. The day after the arrests, secretaries in the creep offices saw executives removing documents from the file cabinets and heading out to burn them. Gordon Liddy saw the writing on the wall as well, so he started to try to cover his tracks. He went to his safe, took the rest of the nicely wrapped stacks of sequentially numbered $100 bills, and he shredded them. He told his compadre Howard Hunt that it might be a good idea to get out of town for a while. Hunt agreed and went to California, hoping to stay there until things quieted down a bit. As the FBI began their investigation, things were quickly coming into focus for the man charged with spearheading that investigation, Assistant FBI Director Mark Felt. The burglary group had links to the White House. The target of the break-in were the offices of the White House opposition. The address book found at the burglary site linked people in the group to the White House. But aside from the puzzle pieces becoming a little clearer, Felt was having trouble putting them together. That's because every time Felt asked questions to members of the administration, he got stonewalled. Well, if that's how Mark Felt felt, he would have felt right, because that's exactly what the White House was doing. The lawyers in the Nixon administration were closing ranks. Nixon's special counsel, Chuck Colson, the guy who actually brought Howard Hunt into the fold, Colson issued a statement claiming that he had no knowledge of the break-in. John Ehrlichman, the guy who signed off on the plumber's break into the psychiatrist's office during the Pentagon Papers operation, he also claimed to know nothing. So did the deputy director of Creep and also Nixon's chief of staff. That last one, the chief of staff, that's particularly rich. Nixon's chief of staff had $350,000 in cash sitting in his White House safe. Yet he's claiming to the press that the administration is completely above board. Well, this is the way the White House decided to go. Deny, deny, deny. The tone for the president's approach was set forth best by his former Attorney General John Mitchell, now the head of the re-election campaign, head of the Creep Committee, and the person who authorized the Watergate break-in. He told the press, the re-election campaign had nothing to do with this. John Mitchell might have been the key lawyer who got the administration into hot water, but there was another key lawyer who would be tasked with getting them out. White House counsel John Dean would be responsible for getting the Nixon administration through the debacle and coming out clean. Dean began by starting an investigation. Now, Dean's investigation wasn't trying to get to the bottom of what happened. They all knew what happened. They all knew who did it, and they all knew who ordered it. The investigation was an attempt to deflect attention from the White House. It was an attempt to control the narrative and spin the matter so that the world didn't connect the break-in to the White House. The goal for all of them was to stop the police investigation from going upward. Don't give the press, the cops, or the public any information that would connect the burglars at the bottom to the President of the United States at the top. And they were doing a pretty good job. The administration gelled so quickly and so strongly that they stymied the FBI investigation. FBI investigator Mark Felt sensed it after only a few days of researching the case. Every time he pursued a lead, the administration seemed to be able to stop him in his tracks, and Felt he didn't know why. The answer would be revealed years later. In a lengthy self-assessment of their tactics during the Watergate investigation, the FBI admitted that they made one critical mistake. They allowed White House counsel John Dean to sit in on almost all of the key interviews of White House personnel. As a result, the man who was in charge of the cover-up knew everything about what the FBI was learning about the cover-up. Dean knew exactly who the FBI was interviewing, and he knew exactly what the people from the White House were saying to investigators. So it was easy for the White House to counter the FBI's investigation. Woodward and Bernstein had been tracking the Watergate story intensely. They were chasing down any lead they could find, both in and out of the government. It made sense then for the duo to call Mark Felt, the FBI agent who was leading that investigation. They didn't know that, at the time they reached out, Mark Felt was feeling quite frustrated. So when they asked Felt if he wanted to talk, they were probably shocked when he said yes. Fun fact, the metro stop in Roslyn, Virginia has the second longest escalator in the Northern Hemisphere. It's true. The city of Roslyn, Virginia sits on top of a bluff over the Potomac River. A bluff is basically a cliff. The city looks out over the Potomac, and it has great views of Washington, D.C., which is located on the banks on the other side of the river. While that might be majestic for the residents of Roslyn, it was a nightmare for engineers. When they were building the subway system in D.C., the engineers had a problem when it came to building the Roslyn station. There was a really long run that they had to make under the Potomac River, and once they got to the Roslyn side, they realized that the topography of the bluff meant that it was more structurally sound to bore the tunnel through solid rock. The result is that the Roslyn Metro stop is the deepest one in the entire system. And when riders get off the train, they have to travel way back up to the surface. Hence, the need for the second longest escalator in the Northern Hemisphere. I know all of this because I took the Metro to the Roslyn stop a few years ago. I heard that a particular building was going to be taken down, and I wanted to see it before it was demolished. I got off the train at Roslyn and took the 3-minute ride to the surface. Yes, it takes 3 full minutes to ride that escalator. I took the 3-minute ride to the surface, and I went around the corner to a very basic office building that looks like it was built in the 60s. I think that's probably why they want to take it down. It makes sense that they want to demolish it. The building is in bad shape. But I didn't walk into the lobby of the building. I walked into the parking garage. I went into the floor-level entrance, and I took the dark, creepy stairs down to level D. When I got to level D, I walked all the way to the far end of the garage to the last stall on the floor. There, all the way in the corner, in the back part of the dark, deserted parking garage, was parking stall number D32, the exact spot where Woodward and Bernstein met FBI Director Mark Felt. Felt confirmed that he would help the young reporters with their story, but there would be some conditions. First, Felt's identity needed to be kept secret. Second, they couldn't quote the assistant director. Third, Felt wouldn't leak new information. He'd only confirm information they had already obtained. Personally, I think that last requirement was for Felt more than anything else. Cooperating with the press in this way was a betrayal of his duties. Maybe that last requirement was what let him sleep at night. Woodward and Bernstein agreed to those conditions. They left the garage and returned to the newsroom at the Washington Post, where they filled in their editor on the situation. They had an informant, they explained, but he was talking on deep background, which meant that the reporters couldn't even indicate that there was a source. But what would they call him around the newsroom? Woodward's editor remembered a popular porn movie that was recently released. He said, well, let's see, the source is on deep background. Deep background? Deep? Why not call him Deep Throat? The name stuck. The question for the Nixon administration was, what now? The next step had to be to make the entire episode go away, but that wasn't going to be easy. The burglars had been arrested and they were charged with crimes. Well, it didn't take too long for a consensus to emerge about the best approach. The goal would be to get the burglars to plead guilty, take their punishment, and keep their mouths shut. If the burglars took the hit and kept quiet, the administration would be insulated. But how could they convince the burglars to take the fall? Appealing to their sense of patriotism would only go so far. The answer was sitting inside the safes and safety deposit boxes of the powerful members of the Nixon administration. They'd pay off the burglars. If the White House could cover the legal bills that the burglars would be facing and also put a crap ton of money in each of their pockets, then those men might be convinced to take the fall and keep their mouths shut. They could plead guilty quietly, accept the meager penalty that was coming to them, and be comforted by the fact that they now had a fat bank account. Everyone agreed that this was the best option, but they also knew that it was going to cost money. Not to worry. It was time to turn the money spigot back on. The administration would go out and raise the money from donors and put it all into a secret fund that they would use to finance the operation. What started out as the White House distancing itself from the burglary had now advanced into a full-blown cover-up. Nixon's former White House counsel, John Ehrlichman, was charged with getting the money together, but he couldn't do it personally. There needed to be a buffer so the White House wouldn't be implicated. Plus, Ehrlichman couldn't just tell someone to go raise money that would be used to bribe the burglars into silence. So Ehrlichman tapped another lawyer who worked with Richard Nixon on his personal matters, and Ehrlichman, well, he duped that other lawyer. Ehrlichman told the other lawyer that they needed help raising money for the legitimate defense costs being faced by the burglars. With that assurance, the guy hit the pavement and went looking for money. After researching the way this all went down, I find it hard to believe that the lawyer who went out to raise that money didn't at least have an inkling that something wasn't kosher. Just think about this part of the cover-up. $70,000 came from the safe in the office of Nixon's chief of staff. Okay, so the lawyer might not have known where that came from. But after being handed that cash, he got another $75,000 in cash in a package from a corporate executive. And if that wasn't enough to raise alarm bells, how about what he was asked to do with that cash? He gave all of it, which at that point was around $230,000. He gave all of it to a retired New York City police officer. The former cop then took that money and hid it in airport lockers, telephone booths, and motel lobbies. Once the money was all deposited in its place, Howard Hunt's wife would collect it and distribute it to the burglars and their lawyers. It was a hell of an operation, and it was working. The burglars got the money for bail, they got money to pay their lawyers, and they got a monthly cash payment on top of all of that. The burglars who were arrested were formally charged with crimes in September. And when that happened, the Nixon administration was pleased. The situation was looking good for Nixon. The only people indicted were 7 low-level individuals, and the charges they faced, like burglary and federal wiretapping charges, they were all relatively mild. That meant that the administration's efforts to insulate the White House were working. The payoffs were keeping everyone quiet. The FBI, Woodward, Bernstein, none of them were getting too much information. The investigation stopped with the burglars, and it didn't move up the chain of command. But Woodward and Bernstein were making progress, and their efforts were causing cracks in the cover-up story. There was a big article that would come out very soon. Later that month, the reporters found out about the money being collected to pay the burglars. They reported that the leader of the re-election campaign, lawyer John Mitchell, was controlling a secret fund that was being used to pay the burglars. When the Post reporters confronted Mitchell about the story, he threatened them. In response, not only did they print the story about the secret fund, but they printed the threat too. The article was a blockbuster. The reporting duo also got hold of the address book that was found at the scene of the burglary. Bob Woodward saw Howard Hunt's name in it as Howard Hunt, White House. Woodward decided to investigate it further. He tracked down Howard Hunt and got him on the phone. He said, "How come your name was in the address book of 2 of these burglars?" Hunt was shocked. He shouted out, "Good God!" and then slammed down the phone and left town. Deep Throat confirmed that Hunt was indeed a chief suspect. The next month, the reporters cranked up the pressure more and more. Woodward and Bernstein printed more articles connecting the administration to the break-in. The articles were all sourced from deep within the FBI. But the Nixon White House, they were able to deflect all of that reporting. They claimed that the reports were nothing more than the product of a vendetta that the liberal Washington Post had against the White House. And Nixon was certainly helped by the fact that papers who were sympathetic to his administration were not pursuing the story at all. Besides, it's not so difficult to believe that the public would believe Nixon because he was very popular. It was November of 1972, and he just won re-election. That's right, with all of this going on, in November, Creep's efforts were rewarded. Richard Nixon was indeed reelected, and it was done in a landslide. He won 520 electoral votes, and his opponent won 17. But while the administration should have been celebrating and looking forward, they were actually worrying and looking over their shoulders. Keeping the burglars content was a full-time job. The operation of the slush fund being used to pay them was operated by lawyer and creep leader John Mitchell, and that really took a lot of time. But it was working. Despite the fact that the Nixon administration was being dragged through the mud in the newspapers, there wasn't any credible danger of the higher-ups in the administration actually getting dirty. The final part of the plan was ready to go into effect. The burglars were going to take the fall. In January of 1973, the burglars, Gordon Liddy, and Howard Hunt all went to trial. Based on the relatively mild charges, the trial should have been quick and uneventful. The plan was for them to get punished, but not too badly, and then the Nixon White House would put the arrest and the break-in behind them. They'd direct their attention to the business of the American people, and they'd steamroll forward. But there was a key player who didn't intend on cooperating. The judge who presided over the trial of the Creep members was not treating it like a run-of-the-mill burglary case. Judge John Sirica suspected that there was a broader conspiracy at play. He believed that there was something deeper being hidden, and he was prepared to use whatever lawful means at his disposal to ferret things out. So when the trial got started, the judge pressed the witnesses on matters that weren't covered in the indictment. Specifically, he probed into the involvement of both the White House and the re-election campaign in the Watergate burglary. The judge's pressure seems to have had some impact. Just 3 days after the trial began, most of the defendants saw the futility of it all. 5 burglars, including Howard Hunt, pled guilty. But 2 people did not. Gordon Liddy and Security Chief James McCord. They both went through with the trial. It didn't make much of a difference, though, because they were convicted less than a month later. And you know what? No one was surprised. No one was surprised. Not President Nixon, not his former chief counsel, lawyer John Ehrlichman, not the head of his re-election, lawyer John Mitchell, not his White House counsel, John Dean. Everybody knew that the burglars would be convicted. And they were okay with that because they could all see the finish line. Liability of the burglars had been established at trial. They were found guilty, and the next step in the process was for them to be sentenced. This is the way it was supposed to go. The judge had to hear arguments from the prosecution and the defendants about what each side thought the appropriate amount of the punishment should be, and then the judge, after hearing that, would make a determination. The Nixon administration surely believed that they were looking at the finish line. Once these guilty men received their modest punishments, the entire fiasco would fade off into the distance. And that's probably just would have happened if they didn't run into the notorious Maximum John. Oh, did I forget to mention the nickname of the judge presiding over the trial? Judge John Sirica was known as Maximum John for his tendency to issue harsh sentences against defendants who appeared before him. And he was going to use that reputation as leverage to get to the bottom of things. The judge just knew that this burglary was bigger than it appeared. He just knew that the knowledge of these events went higher upstream, and he was going to use his powers during sentencing to figure that out. So he turned up the heat. Judge Sirica gave the burglars an option. He said, either talk about the seedy details of this burglary, or I'm sending you to jail for decades. The defendants had some time to think over what they would do. The court was going to adjourn, and it would reconvene to discuss sentencing in a few months. But Judge Sirica's threat caused the pressure on everyone to build. And that pressure was reaching 11 when it came to one lawyer in particular. The president's White House counsel, John Dean, started to panic. The judge's actions caused the lawyer to start to hear something. After months of covering up the burglars' crimes, John Dean started to hear the soundtrack. It's almost as if Judge Sirica pressed the power button on a stereo and made the music come to life. All of a sudden, John Dean could hear the strings coming in, warning him that he was in a dark, dangerous place. Of course, it might not only have been the judge's approach that heightened Dean's awareness. It could have been the fact that the Senate had just voted 77-0 to open a formal investigation into the Watergate break-in. Yeah, it was probably both of those things that turned the soundtrack on in John Dean's mind and caused him to finally contemplate the extent of his own responsibility in the Watergate cover-up. John Dean listened to the soundtrack carefully and decided that it was time to do something. It was time for him to give the straight dope to the President of the United States. Dean met with President Nixon on March 21st, 1973. The burglars had not yet been sentenced. The Senate had not yet started to have hearings on the break-in, but it was all looming. And during that meeting, Dean presented Nixon with the harsh reality. He said, "We have a cancer in the presidency that's growing." He explained that things were becoming more bleak for the administration with each passing day. Woodward and Bernstein's reporting was turning public opinion. The judge's threats had the potential to flip the burglars, and the Senate was about to use its immense power to look into everything. Dean tried to convince the president to end the cover-up and tell the truth. But President Nixon, he had no intention of coming clean. In fact, he was thinking about how he could get even dirtier. Nixon rejected the idea of telling the truth outright and instead contemplated ideas for intensifying the cover-up. There was a plan to increase payments to the Watergate burglars to as much as $1 million in cash to continue to keep them quiet. Listen, if they were facing more prison time, then maybe they needed more money to stick to the plan. Part of that money would be paid to Howard Hunt, who had recently been making additional demands in return for his silence. And Oh, yeah, about Howard Hunt. Nixon mentioned that someone floated the idea of pardoning Howard Hunt in return for his silence. Nixon discussed that possibility as well. Richard Nixon, it seems, only intended to move in one direction, further into the abyss. John Dean tried to convince the president otherwise. He pointed out that paying hush money to stop witnesses from testifying before Congress and asking them to perjure themselves in court was against the law. He said that dangling pardons for people like Howard Hunt constituted obstruction of justice and that people were going to go to jail. And he included himself, John Dean, in the group of people who might be going to jail. The meeting broke, and the president stayed on the course that he described. He went further into the cover-up. According to testimony that would come out later, that night, $75,000 in cash was delivered to Howard Hunt. The next day, the president's campaign chief, John Mitchell, allegedly told the president that Mr. Hunt wasn't a problem any longer. But any relief the president felt from placating Howard Hunt would be dispelled very soon. That is because James McCord was thinking. James McCord, the former chief of security for Creep, who had pled guilty in court just a short while ago, spent the months after the trial thinking about one thing: prison. If Judge Sirica went through with his threat, McCord could be facing decades behind bars. The truth is, Judge Sirica didn't realize just how big of a monkey wrench he had thrown into the Creep machine. The key part of getting the cover-up to work was the fact that the burglars weren't going to get too harsh of a penalty. That's the reason they agreed to fall on their swords. But Judge Sirica's threat completely changed the calculation. And that is why James McCord cracked. After thinking things over, James McCord knew what he had to do. He wrote a letter to Judge Sirica where he told the judge everything. He told about the political pressure that was applied to the defendants to plead guilty and remain silent. He explained that perjury occurred during the trial, and he revealed that there were many others involved in the Watergate operation who were not identified. On March 23, 1973, James McCord's letter was read in open court, and everyone heard what he said. President Nixon must have realized that things were about to head downhill and fast. The Senate was about to start hearings on the Watergate matter, and those legislators must have been energized after hearing James McCord's words. You could almost see them licking their political chops, getting ready to take the testimony of as many important members of the administration as possible. And Richard Nixon was a savvy political guy. He must have known that one of the people they'd be talking to was his White House counsel, John Dean. It made sense. In a criminal conspiracy, the person who's the most dangerous to the boss is his closest confidant. That's the person who knows where all the bodies are buried. And that is the person who the authorities go after to try to flip. So Nixon must have known that John Dean would be called before Congress. And that's probably why the president called his White House counsel for a meeting in his office. During that meeting, John Dean could feel that Nixon was probing him. He was obviously trying to figure out whether Dean would blame Nixon in any upcoming testimony. The president was also doing a little cover-up himself. For instance, he tried to make Dean believe that he was only joking when he talked about getting more money to continue paying off the burglars in their last conversation. Sure, John Dean must have thought. Sure, Mr. President, you're such a kidder. And then something strange happened. President Nixon got up and walked to the other side of the room. He motioned for John Dean to follow him. The president leaned a little closer to his White House counsel, and he whispered, "I was wrong to promise clemency to Howard Hunt, wasn't I?" John Dean looked at Nixon and replied, "Yes, Mr. President. That would be considered an obstruction of justice." John Dean stepped out of his own body at that moment and looked around the room. He and the president were standing on the other side of the office, huddled together, whispering to each other. That's when John Dean realized something. This was all being recorded. There was no other reason for the president to have gotten up, walked to the other side of the room, and then whispered such an incriminating comment. It seems that that meeting made John Dean realize that there was no hope in continuing trying to avoid being caught. That's when Dean decided to lawyer up and start cooperating with investigators. The James McCord letter was like a stick of dynamite shoved into the crevice of a large mountain. Once it went off, the entire cliff started to fall apart and rocks careened down the hillside. In the Watergate explosion, that first big rock to come tumbling down was John Dean. But there were plenty of others that followed, and they all seemed to tumble at the same time. Not long after McCord read his letter, Nixon announced the resignations of lawyer John Ehrlichman. He announced the resignation of his chief of staff. He announced the resignation of his attorney general. And plus, he fired White House counsel John Dean. The next year for Richard Nixon was a slow, steady descent into political hell. Just after his inner circle was decimated, the Senate Watergate committee hearings began. They were televised and they captivated the nation. And then the new people that Nixon appointed in his cabinet, well, they betrayed him too. At least that's how Nixon saw it. His new attorney general appointed Archibald Cox as a special prosecutor to independently investigate Watergate. The special prosecutor aggressively pursued evidence, and that infuriated Nixon. But it probably didn't make him as mad as he got when he heard a certain person's testimony before the Senate committee. On June 29, 1973, the president's now former White House counsel, John Dean, gave what is probably the most damning testimony of the entire affair. Dean testified before the Senate committee, and his opening statement alone was 245 pages long. It took him more than 7 hours to read it to the committee. And in it, Dean revealed everything. He talked about Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. It implicated John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, the president's chief of staff, everybody. Dean also explained the detailed misuse of funds raised by Creep and the hush money payments made to the burglars. Dean admitted his own missteps as well. He admitted that the initial report he did about the investigation was just garbage. He acknowledged knowing about the involvement of Howard Hunt, Gordon Libby, and the Creep officials, and he admitted to participating in efforts to obstruct justice. When it came time to question Dean, the vice chairman of the committee asked a now famous question. He said, "Mr. Dean, what did the president know, and when did he know it?" The answer the committee got absolutely sunk Richard Nixon. It was the boss's worst nightmare. His closest confidant aired all of the dirty laundry. He told the committee all about Nixon's involvement in discussions about the break-ins and payoffs to the accused burglars, and Dean revealed that he discussed the cover-up with President Nixon at least 35 times. And then, to put the icing on the cake, Dean also told them that he believed that the conversations in the White House were being recorded. That was the mother of all bombshells. Dean told the committee that he couldn't prove it, but if the senators were to poke around, he felt confident that they would find out the truth. So, that's what they did. The Senate Watergate Committee staff called Alexander Butterfield to testify. He was a longtime aide to Richard Nixon who managed internal security in the Nixon White House. They thought that maybe since Butterfield held that particular position, he'd be able to shed light on John Dean's suspicion that the private meetings with Nixon had been bugged. The Senate investigators asked Butterfield point blank. They asked, "Are conversations in the president's office being recorded?" And Butterfield responded reluctantly. He said, "I was hoping you fellas wouldn't ask me about that." But his answer was yes. 4 years ago, Nixon had ordered the wiretapping of the Oval Office and various other places in the White House, the Executive Office Building, and Camp David. This was the evidence the committee needed. They needed to get at the tapes of those conversations. Those tapes became the focal point of the rest of the investigation because they would either confirm or refute John Dean's testimony. They would be the key evidence that could prove the president's complicity in obstructing justice. The special prosecutor subpoenaed those tapes, but Nixon refused to give them up. The Senate committee also voted unanimously to subpoena the tapes, but Nixon refused to comply with that subpoena as well. He claimed that the tapes were protected under executive privilege. The president's refusal set the stage for a constitutional showdown. Everybody sued. Everybody sued, and they all demanded that the president turn over the tapes. The courts agreed with the plaintiffs and ordered the president to turn them over, but Nixon refused to comply. He had an idea, though. Maybe there was a deal to be made. Nixon proposed a compromise. Instead of releasing the tapes, Nixon offered to provide written summaries of the recordings. Yeah, the compromise was rejected by the special prosecutor. So, you're the president of the United States. You made a proposed compromise. It was rejected by the special prosecutor. So what do you do when a special prosecutor doesn't give you what you want? You fire him. That's right. Nixon fired the special prosecutor. Well, at least he tried. When he ordered his attorney general to fire the special prosecutor, the attorney general refused to do so, and he resigned instead. The next guy in line also refused to fire the special prosecutor, and he also resigned instead. Eventually, Nixon found someone in his administration who would fire the special prosecutor, and he was gone. Unfortunately for Nixon, it didn't make much difference. The special prosecutor's replacement also demanded the tapes. So, Nixon abolished the office of the special prosecutor. And when that happened, Nixon's new attorney general also resigned. Nixon was under immense public and congressional pressure, and he eventually agreed to comply with the court's order to release some of the subpoenaed tapes. To the public, however, Nixon maintained his innocence. He famously told the nation, "I am not a crook." But when the recordings were reviewed, a lot of people felt otherwise. One reason was that the content of the tapes destroyed Nixon. They confirmed key aspects of John Dean's testimony, including Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. The other reason people weren't so sure that Nixon was not a crook was because there was a part of one of the conversations missing. Nixon's attorneys revealed that one of the subpoenaed tapes had an 18-and-a-half-minute gap. Experts later determined that the gap existed because it was erased. The Senate now believed the tape was deliberately tampered with, and it supercharged their investigation. The Senate demanded that Nixon release all of the tapes in full, and they asked the Supreme Court of the United States to order that happen. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release all of the subpoenaed tapes. And that was when it really all fell apart for the president. When the tapes were released, the Watergate investigators found a key recording. That recording is forever known as the smoking gun. It was a recording made of a conversation that occurred only 6 days after the Watergate break-in, where President Richard Nixon told his chief of staff to tell the FBI to stand down in their investigation. It was crystal clear obstruction of justice. When the content of that conversation became known, Congress started the process of impeaching the president. But Richard Nixon beat them to the punch. On August 8, 1974, President Richard Nixon took to the television airwaves and announced his resignation. He was the first president in U.S. history to resign. The following day, in the East Room of the White House, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. Ford declared, "Our long national nightmare is over." As for the players and what happened to them, James McCord, the security officer for the Nixon Re-election Committee, whose letter was the beginning of the end, he pleaded guilty to 8 counts in the burglary and served 4 months in prison. Bernard Barker, the man whose money in the Miami bank did in the creep peeps, he served 1 year and 19 days. He also received 3 years probation for the break-in at the psychiatrist's office over the Pentagon Papers. The other plumbers and creep burglars all served anywhere from 4 months to a year. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General and the head of the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign, he served 9 months in prison. And John Ehrlichman, the lawyer and old friend to Mr. Nixon, he was convicted of obstructing justice and lying to a grand jury in connection with the burglary, and also convicted of violating the rights of Daniel Ellsberg's former psychiatrist. He served 18 months. John Dean, former counsel to the president and the man who brought it all down, he pled guilty to 1 count of conspiring to obstruct justice and to defraud the United States in connection with the cover-up. He was sentenced to anywhere between 1 and 4 years in prison, and he was released after serving a little less than 4 months. G. Gordon Liddy, the mastermind behind Gemstone and the Watergate break-in, he spent the most time behind bars. It was mostly because he obstinately refused to accept responsibility for his actions. A court once said, quote, "This defendant has not shown the court the slightest remorse or regret for his actions and has not given the court even a hint of contrition or sorrow, nor has he made any attempt to compensate for his illegal actions by trying to aid our system of justice in its search for the truth." G. Gordon Liddy served 4.5 years in prison. When E. Howard Hunt pled guilty, he was given up to 8 years in jail. Shortly after entering the guilty plea, he tried to retract it, but that didn't work. After his claim to undo his guilty plea ultimately proved unsuccessful, he reported to prison. Maybe prophetically, he was sent to serve the sentence in the state where his fame was created, the place where he trained those Guatemalan insurgents all the way back in the 1950s. He went to jail in Florida. Hunt served 2.5 years of his sentence, and he was released on parole in 1977. But by that time, he was broken. He was physically attacked in jail. He suffered a stroke while behind bars. Eventually, his wife passed away, and he was rendered all but broke by the lawyer's bills he had to pay to defend himself. Some way to treat a loyal spy. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Those 3 sections on the Watergate matter were kind of long. I hope you enjoyed them. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Go to the goodlawyersgonebad.com website in the Contact Us section. Send me a note. Tell me what you thought about these episodes. I'd really like to know. Thanks so much for listening. More episodes coming soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.